Today we'll be focusing on engineering leadership positions, and by that I mean not just engineering managers across different levels, but also others such as product managers and TPMs specifically as well. And we'll focus on what are some of the things that folks that are planning to rotate into different companies in 2026, even after the COVID, in terms of the job landscape, there's still significant demand for these roles. So we'll start with a market reality and then the role clarity. Gonna move on to interviews and evaluation for these roles, how AI is changing expectations for some of these roles. Welcome again for Cracking Tech Interview Management session for 2026. All right, this is the more specific view of the agenda. So we'll start with a market reality and then go over the others, starting with market reality. So first off, to start, all three roles that we're focusing on today, product managers and CEMs, they sit in this intersection of the product, engineering, business, and customers and so on, right? And collectively, they drive what to build, how to build it, how to deliver it, who builds it, and so on, right? There's some overlap there between the roles. So these roles are essential across any kind of company, not necessarily just tech-first companies or tier one companies, but also across Fortune 500, any kind of company that has significant development department. And, these roles are going to be critical. And especially at this time and age, there are a lot of what would be typically considered non-tech companies. They are going digital, right? So with all that, there is significant effort and investment needed into the tech. Even after the correction after the COVID in terms of the job landscape, there's still significant demand for these roles. Now, it's a different question and different topic on how to secure these roles and what are things that you need to have to land, where it's a PM, TPM, and EM jobs. Those are things that did change slightly, and we'll cover those in later slides. Very quickly, here's what the demands look like. And these are projected demands based on some of the external data across PMs, TPMs, and then EMs as well. So there will be increased demand in the foreseeable future. There's some interesting data points here around the openings per year. I believe this is for the current year, but then the projections are for the upcoming years as well. So at least that part is encouraging. However, like I mentioned earlier, is even though there might be jobs increasing in certain concentration across these roles, the criteria slightly changed, and what separates good versus great candidates for these roles did slightly change as well.
If you are liking this video, then you love what I have to say next. You can spend months learning agentic AI or cut that time into half with a structured program by Interview Kickstart, where you actually build and ship 2 AI agents into production with a mentor from Faang guiding you through every step. It's called Agentic AI Career Boost Program. And if you think it's just another generic course, spoiler alert, it's not. It's customizable depending on your domain. Engineers, you have a Python-based AI engineering path. If you're a PM or a manager, you take no-code, low-code use case path. And both paths could be paired with Faang interview prep for AI-driven roles. But the best way to learn more about this program is through the free webinar. Here you can get all the details about the program, ask your questions, and see if it's the right fit for you. And if it is, you'll be joining a company of 25,000 professionals who have already leveled up through Interview Kickstart. Many now at Faang, Anthropic, OpenAI, already crossing 300K plus. And here is what some of them say. I'll put the link to the free webinar in the description, as well as pin it in the comments so you don't miss it. See you all there.
One of the things that everybody noticed, obviously, is there were a lot of layoffs throughout not just this year, previous year as well, which means there is a big influx of the candidates on the market and so on. But one of the things that has been observed is that there is, even though there might be, generally speaking, more candidates on the market, there is lack of candidates that have specific skills, whether it's AI or skills in a specific domains, like whether it's fintech, e-commerce, and whatnot, right? And the average time to fill some of those, even though companies are processing a lot of candidates and so on, the average time to fill it didn't necessarily shrink to a relative minimum. But the companies are still taking time and making sure that they're finding the right perfect candidates. One of the things to note is this last comment on the slide. And by the way, this was philosophy across a lot of tier one companies for a very long time now. That the philosophy is companies would rather wait to find a great candidate versus a mediocre one. Now, that philosophy is more widespread across the board. And in addition to that, companies have luxury to not only wait for a perfect candidate that's solid across technical, behavioral, and so on, but also candidates that have specific experience they're looking for, whether it's industry-specific experience, domain-specific experience, and so on. This slide captures on a high level compensation bands on the top of the market. So these are the tier one and some of the top startups, and the data is based on the levels FYI. So there is obviously the difference is significant. This slide doesn't capture low and the mid range for these roles, but assuming folks might be aware of those, so you'll notice that differences it can be significant here. One clarification here, as folks might not be familiar, the total compensation, especially for tier ones and startups, it's usually a mix of base salary, bonus, which is typically in cash, but then also equity. So for a lot of tier ones, a lot of public companies, this is going to be in form of RSUs, or basically stocks that vest over a period of time. All right, moving to the next slide. Here are some of the realities based on 2025. So like I mentioned earlier, even though demand might be up for specific roles in specific geographic areas, the hiring is very selective, and if you're coming from the candidate side, if you're looking for a job, slower, right? Because there is higher focus in some of the specialized areas where it's AI integration, cybersecurity, cloud infra expertise, and so on. So even though jobs are there, the time to hire is still relatively long. AI is hiring accelerant, and there's large, and I think in one of the future slides we have the actual numbers of the incremental number of basically how AI related jobs are increasing or openings are increasing, and this is combination of roles that where EMs, TPMs, and PMs that will be leading and building AI specific products, or roles that even though you might not be working on AI specifically, AI is strongly preferred, and in the job descriptions and so on, it is listed as one of the either nice to haves or one of the prerequisites as well. The last thing here is the landscape in terms of tech jobs. If you go back, say 6-7 years ago, when it came to most attractive companies in terms of compensation and type of work and so on, typically those were Faang-like companies, right? So or potential some other tier one companies, but the pool was much smaller. Today, that pool is bigger in terms of the tier one companies, or kind of what's considered tier one in terms of the tech. That number in US probably around 50-ish or so. But in addition to that, there's a number of startups, attractive startups with a high potential that are also competitive when it comes to conversation and so on, right? So that's what contributes to the overall demand. All right, now we're gonna move to the role clarity across these three different roles, and we'll start with engineering managers. So engineering managers, they own teams, people, as part of that, building a team, coaching, career development, and the engineering execution for one or more teams. If you're a line manager, probably gonna be managing one team. If you're manager or managers, directly and indirectly, you gotta be managing more teams. One caveat that I would like to mention here is when it comes to engineering execution, it's not just execution, but it's also your involvement in strategic planning as well. So that's the reason I want to call out that's one of the main differences I notice when candidates are coming, especially if you're coming from consulting or vendor background, or some tier 2, tier 3 companies where there is a clear line between here's a product, they build a roadmap, and then you execute it. A lot of tier 1 companies, well, pretty much most of tier 1 companies and a lot of startups, that line is very blurry, very blurrier. And you are expected to contribute to the strategy, develop business acumen. Even though there would be product managers that are directly responsible for that, still you're expected to influence it and so on, right? So that's one thing I want to mention in addition to some of these core ownership areas. I went over about the first box there, hiring, coaching, performance management, team culture. So you're on the hook for all of that. Delivery, obviously, so not just the developing roadmap, planning, and working with stakeholders to come up with a roadmap, synchronizing across dependencies, stakeholders, and so on, but delivering with high quality, reliability, and as part of that, along the way, enforcing best practices and so on. As an EM, depending on on which level you are, you will be at some point responsible for providing technical direction. So even though you're not gonna be designing systems yourself and you're not gonna be implementing things, you are responsible for making sure, basically for everything, all the technical deliverables that your teams deliver, right? So you need to make sure that you have a strong team and that you can mentor folks within your team when it comes to making right system design trade-offs, right decisions on the what kind of technology to use, best engineering practices, best operational practices, how you keep the quality high, overall health of your systems, and so on, right? So for that reason, this is commonly probed in the interviews as well. In one of the later slides, I'll go into what are some of the more on more granular level, how what specific tech competencies are covered and so on, right? But that is one of the expectations. The higher level you go, so senior manager or managers or a director, the higher you go, less you're going to be involved in technical direction. However, still there will be some involvement. So even on a technical or in some case, even on the VP level, you will be needed to provide inputs and some high level guidance, at least on a technical direction across your organization. And then engineering health. I briefly touched upon that in terms of the engineering and operational health, about all the basic stuff, velocity, code quality, on-call, and what does operational health look like, tech depth, testing, deployment practices, CI/CD, all that good stuff, right? One of the other differences between tier 3, tier 2 companies and some of the top tier ones is in top tiers, EMs tend to own everything, right? So you're responsible for everything. From testing, from deployment, well, not necessarily customer support, but operations and so on, right? Now, there might be some centralized teams that might be able to help you here and there, but generally speaking, you still need to understand what are the best practices, how to drive it in the absence of help from other teams. All right, now we're gonna move into the next slide that provides kind of percentage or the responsibility coverage for EMs. One of the things that you'll notice on this slide is, okay, EMs, they wear a lot of different hats and basically they're responsible for everything. So that's out of the 3 roles, I would say, yes, EMs typically tend to wear the most hats and are either directly or indirectly responsible for most in terms of the coverage. So even some of the bottom ones, product strategy, like I mentioned, even though that might not be your main responsibility, and even though there might be a product team that is responsible for product strategy and product roadmap, still, you need to be able to not just understand it and convert it into a deliverable plan and deliver against it, but also you need to be able to influence it, negotiate it, use your business judgment, your business acumen that you developed over time, and so on. Same thing for analytics as well. Even though there might be a data science team or team of BIEs that help slice and dice data, you should still be able to understand some of it and be able to ask the right questions around the metrics and so on. All right, now we're going to move to TPMs or tech program managers. So as a TPM, you own program execution, delivery of complex cross-team initiatives. One thing I like to point out here, it's not necessarily just programs, but projects as well. The reason why I mentioned that is definition of TPMs might vary across companies. And even in some cases within the same company, the expectations might be different. So when I mention what I mean by program versus project is, as a program manager TPM whose focus is on a program manager, you're going to be focused on a program that has a lot of different inputs. There might be a number of different tech projects contributing to it. There might be non-technical projects as well. So you have relatively wide audience that need to manage a lot of moving pieces and so on. On the other side, you could be assigned to drive a execution of a specific project, say extra large project that's maybe multi-year. Maybe it includes or requires collaboration across 50 different teams. So a lot of different data points there, a lot of different stakeholders there they need to manage in the context of a single project, right? And then at the same time, it might be a mix of both. So for instance, at Amazon or my past experience at Amazon, I manage a number of different TPMs as well. And expectations of when I would need the TPMs to manage program aspects of things versus leading projects, it varied, right? It varied based on organizational needs. So there needs to be some of flexibility. Anyhow, here are some of the core ownership areas listed. So obviously, program planning and similarly for project as well, defining milestones, dependencies, risk management, proactively identifying potential bottlenecks, addressing them, and so on. Cross-team dependency management and cross-functional stakeholder management is critical. So you'll be communicating with not just engineering teams, but non-technical teams as well, including product, legal, customer representation, other engineering teams like science, testing, data engineering, depending on what the organizational model looks like. Status reporting communication across all levels is super important. So you're going to need to be able to communicate with the junior engineers all the way up to VPs and be able to modify your communication based on who the audience is, right? So how you communicate status reports, obviously is going to be different based on the top line manager versus a VP of organization or a CTO, right? So that distinguishment is important. And then obviously ensuring successful delivery in time with the right quality and so on. One thing that not mentioned here, but I do want to call it out is as a TPM, you have a lot of responsibility, but no authority, right? So typically as a TPM, you don't have individuals that are directly reporting to you. However, you are on the hook. So if you are leading a project, if you're a TPM for a project and there are some issues, you're the first person I'm going to go to. You're responsible for it, even though you might not have authority, right? So that's one important thing to understand, and it could be frustrating, but also it could be opportunity as well. And for that reason, it's important to have a good cross collaboration, collaborative skills, be able to build relationships across various stakeholders, across levels, effective communication, and so on. There are, one final comment on this one, rarely there are TPM roles. This is more of a senior principal and above TPMs that do manage other TPMs. So it is possible that there could be roles out there, a TPM manager, where you'll be managing other TPMs. And that's one of the natural growth paths for a TPM. A lot of times as a full growth manager of other TPMs, the other natural step is becoming a senior engineering manager. Here is the map of competencies. So as expected, product strategy is one of those buckets where you don't, as a TPM, you don't necessarily need to worry a whole lot about. So product managers are on the hook for that. EMs also partially as well. When it comes to TPMs, typically you're not responsible for that. You worry more about what to deliver, how to deliver it, what are the best practices, so on, not necessarily what. However, there are, especially this varies across companies and depending on what kind of product you will be managing or program you will be managing. But in some cases, there could be expectations that you do work directly with product on nuances of the product roadmap and so on. Everything else is typically covered, which is reflected in the interviews as well. So execution, technical depth. This is important, by the way, and this is one of the areas where TPM candidates commonly fail. Things like system design interviews, right? So even though as a TPM, you're not going to be designing systems, you're not going to be necessarily designing systems yourself. However, you will be involved in system design discussions, and you will be expected to ask the right questions around technological choices. A lot also asking questions about feasibility of that, taking some shortcuts and so on, right? And for that, you do need to have some technical depth, and that's the reason why those are covered in the interviews. Coding is not covered typically at TPM interviews. Communication, leadership and relationship building, influencing without authority, and all that. That's also heavily emphasized. All right, now we're moving to the third one, product managers. So as product manager, you own the product strategy and the roadmap, right? So you own the product strategy, and by that I mean typically long-term vision for the product, not just for, hey, what are we doing for 2026, but what is next 2-3 years, what are some of those big investments? And not necessarily going into details for the whole 3 years, but at least having some sort of vision, right? And then as part of that, converting that vision into incremental roadmap. So you have a, say, 3-year product vision. Okay, what have you done this year? What are you doing in 2026? Potentially 2027, but I mean, in terms of granular planning, the focus will be 2026 and so on. And then as part of that, you will be also working closely with other stakeholders, including customers, understanding the market, understanding the opportunities, quantifying those opportunities. You will be also aligning with leadership and making sure that your vision is aligned with overall company's vision or organizational vision in terms of the product. You'll be also working closely with engineering teams, so converting the product ideas and the product definition into requirements. So working closely with engineering teams to make sure that you're effectively communicating those requirements, aligning with engineering and other technical teams on the milestones and sequentially how things are going to be delivered, how they're going to be evaluated. For instance, is it A/B tests and what if? So what do the designs of those experiments look like and so on. And then you are on the hook for business outcomes, right? For everything that you do on as a product manager, there will be some sort of outcome metric, right? Revenue or some sort of dollar amount is the obvious one, but there could be a bunch of others as well. Customer satisfaction or how many active users and so on, right? So you need to be able to come up with a roadmap and a vision that is positively impacting some of those KPIs from the product side. Similar comment as for TPMs, meaning you as a product manager typically will not have folks reporting to you. However, there are instances across some companies where you might have folks reporting to you, especially if you are, let's say, relatively high proven and seasoned product manager. So say you might be principal product manager, and your next growth path would be starting to manage other product managers. And then beyond that would be becoming a single-threaded leader, or basically somebody that manages not just product but engineering as well. So generally speaking, across tier one companies, that unification of, when it comes to, from the leadership perspective, product versus engineering happens at a director level. So that's a typical natural growth path for product managers. But I would highlight that this is very rare. Most of the folks don't get to that level. Here are the competencies and the sort of the heat map of where the emphasis is for product managers. So as expected, product strategy, vision, it's high there. Analytics, metrics, so in terms of evaluating the opportunities, quantifying opportunities, and evaluating how the business is moving, at least for your part of the world, super important. Communication, storytelling, influencing, and conflict resolution, very important as well. Note that technical depth is not as important because between engineering teams or EMs, TPM, they own how and the actual execution, implementation, and so on. However, one caveat there is if you are product manager for a highly technical product, like let's say you are product manager at Alias or at certain Oracle teams, for example, or something like that, right? There will be, in that case, there could be high expectation in terms of technical depth and making sure that you do understand system design, for instance, at least on a high level, and that you're able to ask the right questions and so on. Similarly, for execution, even though engineering teams will be owning the execution, you would need to be involved here and there, at least to make sure that you're providing your point of view on identifying and resolving bottlenecks. And then especially when it comes to non-technical execution. So sometimes to execute a project, not everything is about engineering effort. Sometimes it includes collaboration and figuring out things with legal, for instance, or with some of the other teams. And those typically fall on between PMs and TPMs, depending on the landscape. And then similarly for people leadership, even though you're not going to be managing people, you are expected to influence, and just like as a TPM, influence without authority and so on. All right, here's another view on PM versus TPM versus EM comparison there. So just to very briefly go over that, product manager versus EM. So product manager is product success first, and strategy. EM is more about the building a team that is set for success and be able to deliver what the product defines, the execution for it, and so on. Even though, like I mentioned earlier, the line is not strict, there is, in some cases, product managers are expected to be a little bit more involved in some technical decisions, and vice versa. Engineering managers, in some cases, are more expected to influence the product roadmap. TPMs versus EMs. So TPMs focus more on the process management and execution of the project deliverables versus EMs more on the team management and people. And then the last one, product manager versus TPM. So again, product is more focused on what and what is the outcome, what are the business metrics that will be moved, where the needle will be moved, and so on, versus TPM is more focused on making it happen. So execution, working with whatever stakeholders need to be involved, identifying them, looking around the corner to make sure that potential bottlenecks are proactively identified and addressed, and so on. All right, let's move on. Going to move on to interviews and evaluation for these roles, and starting with the engineering managers. So here's the typical structure of an EM loop, and this is by the way same whether you're a line manager or manager of managers. If you get a little bit higher to say director level, there will be some changes there. But typically it's people management and leadership. So as part of people management, it's how you build and set your team for success. Performance management, meaning poor performers, top performers, promotions, and so on. There is technical aspect of it, system design and technical judgment. So system design, self-explanatory. Technical judgment, it could be around engineering excellence or operational excellence in some of those. Execution and delivery, so how you execute the roadmap and projects and what kind of processes and mechanisms you apply along the way. That's very relevant. Like I mentioned in one of the previous slides, you might be expected to also contribute to the product roadmap as well. So as part of that, the actual roadmap and strategic thinking is important. Behavioral and leadership principles and overall cultural fit is also important. And then the last one, which is optional depending on the type of company and the role you're interviewing for, is there might be some coding data points collected. Not all companies collect data points for EMs. Actually, most of them do not, but there are some, like Meta, for instance, that do collect coding data points that have coding rounds for engineering managers. And this might be in a format of either coding, standard coding type of questions like lead code format. You ask a question, you go through requirements, edge case, and so on, and you implement it, right? But then it could be also in the format of the code reviews. So you are presented a couple different samples of code, you go through it, identify what are things that you would improve, what are potential concerns, and so on, right? So this is, again, a minority of companies do that, but in case they do it, it is important to brush up on those things as well. Okay. Here's the evaluation focus for EMs, another cut of it or another view. So people management, briefly talk about some of those details, along with common rejection reasons, right? So for each of these, here is listed some of the common rejection reasons based on the external data. So for instance, when it comes to people management, one of the common one is not having enough people management experience. So for instance, a lot of times we get candidates that want to transition externally into EM role, but they're coming from IC background. So most of the tier one companies, they do expect you to have some level of industry experience in the role that you're entering for. So if you're entering for EM, ideally you would have at least 2 to 3 years of formal, informal EM experience, right? But not all the candidates have. It is typically concerned. However, there are some potential workarounds in how to mitigate some of those things. Another common one is not having good data points around poor performers. Managing poor performers. A lot of companies, especially tier 3, tier 2 companies, performance expectations in terms of how to handle poor performers is a little bit more relaxed and so on. So, for instance, you might have a poor performer on your team sitting for more than a year, for instance, versus at a lot of tier 1 companies, it is expected as part of the culture and overall the guideline identify and address those individuals much faster. So basically taking much quicker action, whether it is managing them up, meaning their performance improved, or managing them out. The other one is technical leadership. I briefly in the previous slide talked about that, but anyhow, one of the common rejections there is lack of technical depth. A lot of candidates, especially the more senior you go and the longer you've been in EM role, naturally, the more rusty you get when it comes to the system design, coding, in case companies are asking for coding and so on, right? So that's one of the things that I would suggest that folks start brushing up, not waiting till the last moment, but come up with some sort of plan and periodically start getting familiarized with some of the main system design concepts, for instance, how to approach system design interviews and so on. Execution is super important and judgment and culture fit overall in terms of corresponding common rejections. Poor communication or extreme styles, that's one of the common ones. When I say extreme styles of management, meaning if you kind of think about it on a spectrum, micromanaging versus being very high level and basically delegating everything, right? Typically, companies are looking for a fine balance. And now what that balance is, it depends on a company. So for instance, what that balance is for Meta for EMs is different than what is at Amazon for EMs, right? So knowing company culture and expectations for the role is super important, and making sure that you are, in your answers, you are elaborating on the balance and to make sure that those things are not coming up as a red flag. Lack of ownership, blaming others for failures, that's self-explanatory. So we can go ahead to the next one. Here are some of the examples of green flags. And now this list is actually much more detailed. These are just some of the top ones. So having good stories around and examples around developing talent and building a healthy culture. One of the examples, for instance, if I ask you a question around, to give me an example where you had to manage a poor performer. Most of the EMs manage poor performers that are in junior roles, like let's say junior engineers. So coming up with that example is good, but typically not bar raising. What would be better is, say, if you have an example of a senior engineer or staff engineer that was poor performer they need to manage, right? Because that takes more judgment, more integrity, has a wider blast radius that you need to mitigate potentially, and so on. Next one is clear articulation of tough decisions and rationale. That one is super important. In addition to the next one, the ability to zoom in and out and provide details when needed. The reason why I highlighting these two specifically is a lot of times when EM candidates fail behavioral interviews, it's not that they don't have rich portfolio where they did impactful and cool and impressive things, right? But it's because they, even though they might be picking the right example to talk about, they don't necessarily in their story articulate well enough what were the impressive data points around the impact, around the complexity of it, around the impressive things when it comes to actions that it took on problem solving, influencing, and so on, right? So it's very important to practice that articulation and stories when it comes to answering behavioral questions. And then humility and self-reflection. So be honest that we all make mistakes. What's more important is how you react or how you address those mistakes, how you learn from it. Not just yourself, but how you enable learning across the wider organization. So, for instance, having a data points where you drive postmortems, where you are self-critical of yourself and a team, but you drive postmortems that have a much wider impact through, for instance, defining action items or process improvements that benefit the whole company or organization and so on. Here's a typical TPM loop, what it looks like. So on a high level, program and project management cases. System design, like I mentioned, is important one. So system design is one of the common technical data points that is typically collected. Behavior and leadership, especially when it comes to ability to influence without authority, and conflict resolution, right? So there's along the way, you're gonna have conflicts across pretty much all the stakeholders. Your ability to negotiate with them, influence them, and do all that in relatively quick time is critical. And then stakeholder management as well, and communicating across levels and roles. Here are some of the what the focus is when it comes to evaluation. These are some of the top ones. The list is a bit more detailed. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to cover all of those. So just on a high level, execution and organization, it is super important. So it's you need to be able to organize the teams around the program and projects and so on. You need to be able to technically influence folks when needed and understand what are the system level deficiencies, why things are prioritized the way they are, where are the opportunities to potentially cut corners, or even in some cases potentially increase tech depth in order to deliver faster, but with a plan on addressing it later on. And communication is very critical, right, across both technical and non-technical stakeholders. Some of the common rejection patterns are vague answers. I think that one is kind of general, applies to EMs, PMs as well. The other one is ability to take a step back and think about it strategically. A lot of, even though strategy is not necessarily expected for TPMs, you are, especially if you are managing a program, you need to be able to demonstrate how you came up with a high level plan for a program, right? Where you're not just tactically managing project by project, for example, but that you have some sort of plan and you are able to operate both at the low level and the high level as well. Conflict resolution or lack of examples of conflict resolution situations is one of the common things. So for instance, if I ask you, tell me about a time where you need to resolve conflict with somebody in an interview, don't pick an example where you had a conflict with an engineer, with a junior engineer, because typically to resolve those kind of conflicts is much more simpler, and I would expect most TPMs to be able to do, versus, say, solving a conflict with a couple different engineering directors, right? So it matters who the conflict is, what is the nature and the complexity of the conflict, and so on. So think about those things as you are prepping up your stories and examples for these kind of questions. And then the last one is failure to identify root cause or improving the process. This is, the reason I mentioned this is a lot of TPMs will focus on how to move the project across the line, and which is the core expectation, right? However, when the bottlenecks are hit, it's also important to think about what are some of the mechanisms that can be introduced or processes that can benefit future projects or programs that you might manage, and not necessarily you, but other teams as well, right? So think about that wider impact there. Here are some of the green flags for TPMs. So moving quickly and being able to make impact in messy scenarios, proactive risk identification mitigation plans, using appropriate technical vocabulary, and here I'm specifically referring to the demonstrating good technical judgment, whether it's in the system design focused interview or it could be also through some of the behavioral questions as well. It is important that you demonstrate that you are not just focused on the execution part, but when needed, you are able to get involved in some of the technical judgment and technical decisions and have stories around that. Collaborative tone is important, and as part of that, making sure that interviewer does have a good feeling about your your skills when it comes to building relationships, influencing without authority, and so on, right? Here, we are going through the same coverage for product managers. So typical product manager interviews are product sense or design. And now this could come in a different format. It could either be hypothetical or it could be probing and asking you about your experience when you design a product and how did you go about it, what are the things you need to consider, the data points, and so on. Strategy and metrics. So again, product strategy is super important, and metrics. So what are some of the KPIs they typically consider, how you work with customers and so on to identify them. Execution part of it on the product side, not necessarily the implementation and so on, but on the product side, how you approach execution, how you make sure that engineering team is set up for success when it comes to execution, at least from your side in terms of requirements, in terms of the milestones, P0s versus P1s, and so on. Ownership and conflict resolution is also important, just as in TPMs. Typically, you as a product manager, you gotta need to be able to influence without authority. So you need to be able to demonstrate great communication skills, influencing, negotiating, and so on. And then, in some cases, technical fluency, especially if you'll be interviewing for type of PM role where you will be owning a product strategy for highly technical product, whether it's Azure, for example. Those are just some of the examples. And here's evaluation focus for PMs. So matching what we previously talked about, product sense and vision, structured thinking, communication, and business and metric orientation, and making sure that whatever you do is moving the right needle or is impacting the right product KPIs in the end, and so on. Some of the common rejection reasons are weak product sense or strategy. For instance, a lot of from personal experience, anecdotally, a lot of product managers I interviewed that are coming from, say, either startups or a tier 2, tier 3 companies. They, in some cases, they don't unfortunately have the ownership of the whole product strategy, but instead they own product on a feature by feature level, right? So it is important to have that wider sense, the strategy, being able to talk about the stories or how you would approach building the strategy for the whole product, as part of that, demonstrating user empathy, working with the customers, users, and so on. Unstructured and rambling answers, I think that one is general across all three roles, PMs, TPMs, and EMs. No evidence of ownership or measurable outcomes. That one is kind of tied to my first comment. So if you come from a environment or a background where you didn't own the full product vision or strategy, well, then this will be one of the concerns. And then insufficient technical fluency, it could be a concern if you are interviewing to be leading a highly technical product. Yeah. And here are some of the green flags, just on a very high level. So starting with users, working backwards from a customer, clear structural breakdown of problems, and so on. Quick time check. I think we're a little bit behind time, so I will go ahead and accelerate a bit so we get enough time for a live speed mock. All right, moving on to the next topic, which is how AI is changing expectations for some of these roles. Like I mentioned previously, even though the total number of roles might be expanding, it's hard to land some of them, and AI has a part there. As some of you might have noticed across news updates, media, and so on, there's a lot of big tech companies and other companies that announce big investments in the AI, and this slide kind of captures that investments not just in 2025, but significant investments through 2026, and that will directly translate into the roles that are being hired and so on. So on the AI part, for AI specific roles, it is very encouraging. And I would add not just AI specific roles, but also other EM, PM, and TPM roles that do have some expectations in terms of utilizing AI. Based on the LinkedIn research, roles that require 2 or more AI skills have advantage in terms of the higher salaries and landing rates in terms of getting jobs. So that's encouraging if you are in the AI field or if you're planning to learn and get more experience in the AI. One thing to add there is it needs to, as part of that, and we'll get in later slides as well, it's important to identify properly when using AI adds genuine value, when it is appropriate versus over-engineering, right? And as part of that, understand the risks, the costs, the latency, and so on. All right. Here's what, on a very high level, what AI-ready looks like across these 3 roles. So for AI-ready PMs, you need to be able to, working backwards from customers and identifying product strategy, product roadmap, you need to be able to identify where potential AI opportunities are for solving specific user problems, business impact, and so on. Another one that I would like to add here is not just necessarily for PMs, but this would be also for EMs and TPMs, is how AI can help accelerate things, especially when it comes to experimentation and validating some of the product decisions. Is it certain features, are they good or bad when it comes to overall impact, right? So it is expected in AI world that a lot of this experimentation moves much faster overall. In terms of TPM roles, it is important to understand not just ML but AI lifecycle as well. And when it comes to managing such projects, understand the overall importance and integration across different phases. Data, including data quality and so on, training, deployment, monitoring, and so on. For EMs. Given that EMs wear a lot of different hats, you are expected to, at least on a high level, super high level, understand what I mentioned previously for PMs. But in addition to that, understand how AI enables your team to move faster, not just in a context of experiments and so on, but day to day as well, right? So when it comes to best practices in terms of using AI assistants for producing code, for instance, or for some of the day to day activities and so on, right? As well as mentioned here, let's say applying and shipping AI features safely and reliably. Here's an interesting survey of PMs in terms of the spread of AI at work. So there's, as mentioned here, there's heavy use of AI in different phases. Similarly applies to TPMs and EMs, especially for day-to-day activities. So, there's some very tactical day-to-day things where it's document generation or analysis, risk analysis, but also things like roadmap management, potential generating things like Gantt charts when it comes to project execution, and so on. Some of the potential product manager interviews when it comes to AI, here are a couple of common examples. Note that these could also be asked in the EM and TPM interviews, especially if you're interviewing for AI-heavy role, right? So, for instance, how would you integrate generative AI into a specific product for that you will be managing in the role that you're interviewing for? So those are some of the interesting things and type of questions to think about. How would you answer them? What are things that you will consider, and make sure that you have deep enough understanding about the basic AI concepts that you're talking about and limitations and so on. Similarly, here are some of the potential TPM questions and EM questions as well. So on the TPM side, it's going to be more around the execution across various phases. As part of that, you might need to work with different teams to make it happen. Balancing the innovation versus the actual delivery versus the privacy, security, quality, and so on. So a lot of that applies just as it would in a lot of other non-AI driven projects as well. For EMs, a lot of things that I mentioned apply as well, because as EM, you have a wider area of responsibility. But in addition to that, there could be questions around AI best practices and how do you use those to accelerate and increase the performance bar for your teams. So how do you use that to keep your engineers accountable to deliver faster, for instance, and so on? And how are you building a team and make sure that your team has know-how when it comes to dealing with AI technology? This slide focuses on future-proofing skills in the AI world. So some of the things that are valuable even more are emotional intelligence and leadership. So AI doesn't replace that. That is still very much needed. Being able to think strategically and coming up with a valid set of problems to solve, and creativity around how to solving them, and what are the things to focus on and so on, right? So those are the things that AI typically doesn't address. AI helps you accelerate how to drive the implementation of some of those things, right? But that creative thinking is still needed. You need to be able to have good understanding when it comes to data literacy, experimentation, what are some of the best practices, and so on. Not just in this domain, but generally as well. So even though AI might be doing certain things on you, or you might delegate certain things to AI, you still need to be able to demonstrate a good fundamentals on double checking AI's work and making sure it still makes sense, right? Versus just using AI blindly and moving on quickly to something else. Adaptability and continuous learning is a must, not just in the context of AI, which is a fast-moving domain, but generally speaking, all of us have been in the IT industry for a while. This has been a trend throughout, but now with AI, it's even more important. And then ethical and critical thinking is something that's getting significantly more important, especially when it comes to AI. Given the power of AI and where it could be used, it is important. And in some cases, there could be interview questions around that.